Alright, so if you look back at the history of Total War games in terms of the base game development philosophy and subsequent DLC policy, you can see a very clear shift that happened right after Attila. Between original Shogun and Medieval 2, Creative Assembly clearly focused on delivering a solid, well-rounded base game, and if the game made enough money, gained enough popularity, it got a follow-up expansion or two that were their own campaigns. In fact, arguably, these expansions could be called sagas by today's standards. Then we got Empire, which didn't get any expansions on its own, but it did get a very quick follow-up major game with Napoleon, which again had that expansion vibe of old, with different smaller scoped campaigns following his military career. And yes, again, arguably these on their own could have been called saga campaigns. But in hindsight, Napoleon basically improved on Empire in pretty much every way, much like Attila did for Rome 2. With Shogun 2 Total War, Rome 2, and Attila, CA continued the trend of campaign-first development with additional content that added new campaigns set in new time periods on around the same map. Rome 2 had a lot more, it's just a more popular game, but Attila had some great expansions, with Age of Charlemagne especially, and Shogun 2 Fall of the Samurai, now a saga game on its own, is basically accepted as one of the greatest expansion campaigns ever made in the series. But then, Creative Assembly did a complete 180 on the formula. Throughout all this time, of course, Total War games were getting more and more paywalls behind playable factions. Yes, we were getting big, beautiful campaigns, but what's the point if a bunch of key cultures and factions were not playable unless you paid for a DLC? The Rome 2 Greek DLC comes to mind, of course, but this kind of practice came well before that. But that's not the point. The point is, CA did a complete 180 on the formula by moving away from releasing full big games with big, chunky, and replayable expansion campaigns to doing the opposite. And all the while with Warhammer Total War, CA doubled down on a policy of releasing a fairly finished game to fix it up in time and sell masses of faction DLCs to keep us going. And in the meantime, the expansion campaigns of old that they'd make for cheaper and bundle them up with the main game, maybe sell it as a gold edition, etc., will just make a little bit more effort there and sell them one by one as standalone saga games. And that's exactly what happened. Thrones of Britannia could very easily have been a DLC campaign to Attila, just as Age of Charlemagne could have been a saga game. The difference is you can buy AOC for pretty cheap as an add-on, but TOB when it first came out was $40. Think about that for a second. We went from getting seriously great DLC add-on campaigns with great value, Rome 2 Empire Divided, Shogun 2 FOTS, to DLC-styled campaigns as standalone games. And of course it worked because people were willing to pay the price. Then we got Troy and we got Total War Pharaoh, and CA put all their eggs in the basket on making their previous expansion campaigns their own standalone games and called them sagas with pretty hefty asking prices. The point I'm trying to make here, guys, is we went from getting a solid game like Medieval 2 with bonus content campaigns like the Americas, the Crusades, the Britannic campaign, to games like Troy or Pharaoh where it felt like you were playing the bonus content first, where there's room to expand the campaign. Pharaoh is a perfect example of this. Creative Assembly 20 years ago probably would have made Pharaoh a full Bronze Age game with all the relevant cultures, factions, Assyrians, Babylon, Mycenaeans, etc., and released a bonus campaign that specifically looked at the Bronze Age collapse. This would have made a lot more sense, but with Saga games, CA changed and the formula did a 180, selling you the teaser bonus campaign first and making a vague promise of expanding the map later. To put this all in a more constructive tone of voice, one way to improve Total War games today overall is to go back to a solid base game first with room for expansion campaigns later. That's part of why we all love Rome Medieval 2 and Shogun 2. These base games are pretty good, maybe in some ways a bit dated, but after all this time you can still pick it up and have a pretty fun campaign. Plus, they have 2, 3, 4 bonus campaigns that take you to new eras, new challenges, and in some, new campaign maps. For me to consider playing Pharaoh in the same way again in like 5 or 10 years' time, CA would have to release an expansion update that covers the rest of the missing cultures. I think that's a given, and it would be nice if they made expansion campaigns again that explored earlier periods in history, maybe when the pyramids were first being built, or when the Minoans were still kicking around dominating trade. Let me put it this way. Would you rather play a smaller base campaign where CA promises they'll make some sort of map expansion down the line, but you'll ultimately be playing the same campaign again with more regions and maybe more factions eventually? Or would you rather play a full massive campaign game, maybe with less faction specific or culture specific mechanics and units, but potential for new DLC campaigns that explore new eras on this map, or even explore completely new separate areas, regions, and territories? See, I think this is one of the reasons why Three Kingdoms was such a blunder for Creative Assembly. Instead of releasing faction packs and cultures, they should have been releasing more eras and even potential map expansions like they promised and like the fans wanted. It would have actually made the game far more successful, made the DLCs far more successful than they ended up being. And you know something else? The Warhammer games actually do this to a certain extent. Warhammer 2 and 3 launched with a specific smaller scoped campaign with unique events, mechanics, and a narrative, and then released the Mortal Empires campaign for Warhammer 2 and expanded Immortal Empires for Warhammer 3. Bigger, more interesting, and complete maps. CA still knows how to do this. It's just they haven't really been doing it very much or very well for the historical side of the franchise. A new Medieval 3 Total War, for example, could be set during the Mongol invasion of Europe, with a base game of continental Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, plus going a little bit further east into parts of Asia and even India. And based on this, I can see CA developing Saga-style smaller campaigns as DLCs to depict the Mongol invasion of China and Japan in their own little campaign map. I can see an America's DLC campaign again, where in Europe, and in kind of like in Medieval 2, you have a race to discover America and then figure out what to do with the natives and the resources you find there. Or better yet, you could have a full Ottoman DLC campaign with a more focused map of Europe, kind of like in the mod Sardam's Total War, where you take control of a weak Eastern Roman Empire trying to survive, or play as the rising power of the Ottomans taking over Europe. One argument against all of this, and I've been hearing this a lot more since especially the release of Pharaoh, is you can easily look at Napoleon or Shogun 2 and say these are smaller scoped games than others, and if released today could easily have been Saga in name. And to be honest, I agree, but the difference here is Napoleon is like 4 different campaigns in one: his Italian, Middle East, European, and Spanish campaigns. And on the other hand, Shogun 2, while I would have loved to have China or Korea in that game, has 2 major campaign DLCs with Rise and Fall of the Samurai, of which, as we know, Fall was rebranded as a Saga for marketing purposes. And not to mention, these games were reasonably priced for the amount of content, value, and replayability that was delivered. Games like Thrones or Troy and Pharaoh simply don't have any of that. Thrones has no DLCs for one, and unless you're a huge fan of British history, just doesn't have any real replayability. Troy is as far away from historical gaming as you can get while still calling it a historical game, and Pharaoh is a game about the Bronze Age collapse with just a third of the Bronze Age world. If you enjoy playing these games, that's absolutely fine, but there is a massive difference between playing a full Napoleon and actually playing all of his military career, or Shogun 2 and not only fighting for the shogunate, but also playing earlier and later eras in Japanese history with these modern Saga games CA has been making. Overall, at a certain point, the Total War series pivoted away from creating full, brilliant games that had additional content that took the player to new places with new faces, new challenges, in new settings, to half-finished, smaller games that promised to see some sort of expansion. Creative Assembly simply needs to go back to the way it was done before. There was immense gameplay value with each new campaign expansion released. Hopefully, with Pharaoh, they finally got the message, and we'll see what happens when the next game releases. And that's it for today, guys. I was just thinking and pondering about how CA did a 180 flip in its development ethos, from full, deep campaigns that had additional DLC campaigns to Saga games with small scope and potential for an expanded map. I'm not sure if the series will ever go back to the way it was done before, but I think it's important to point this out. Instead of DLC factions and cultures, I would really like to see future games have more DLC campaigns that explore new areas, new regions, and new eras of history. I really hope you enjoyed this video and found it informative. If you did, give it a like and drop any thoughts or questions in the comments section below. I'd love to hear what you think about everything I've discussed here today. Subscribe for more strategy game content, gameplay, and news just like this. And thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.